On today's show, we have a trade deadline special where we're going to grade the Mikko Rantanen trade along with many more, as well as delving into the games of many of the prospects dealt during this trade deadline period, as well as answering some questions around why so many first and second round draft picks were dealt around so freely this year, especially. All that and a lot more coming up on this episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm your host, Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects. And on today's show, we're going to be delving into the NHL trade deadline period, which has just wrapped up right now. I'm recording this at 5 p.m. Eastern time here on deadline day, just 2 hours after the window has officially closed, but still some information rolling in at this point. There are many deals that were made, and in the first segment, we'll be delving into the Mikko Rantanen trade especially. Beyond that, we'll also be discussing the Calum, Ritchie, and Brock Nelson deal, and in the second segment, we'll be looking towards the Toronto Maple Leafs and that Scott Laughton trade, as well as the Boston Bruins selling hard with many of their players being shown the exit door just this past day. And in the final segment, we'll be looking at the Pittsburgh Penguins gathering up draft picks for depth pieces, and the San Jose Sharks continuing to sell off their middle of the lineup pieces that are playing more minutes than they would elsewhere, and flipping them for quite a few little draft picks. So a lot to discuss on today's episode. We've got a lot of We've got a lot of trade grades to hand out here as well. But before we delve into the show, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So let's dive into the episode here, starting off with the big fish, the Mikko Rantanen trade, the second Mikko Rantanen trade that we've had here during the trade deadline period, the extended trade deadline period. And the fact that Mikko Rantanen was dealt not only twice in one deadline period, but dealt twice in a seller's market at the deadline. Unbelievable stuff that we've been seeing here this season with trades that we just haven't witnessed at the NHL level at this time of year in a really long time. There's been a lot of big deals here around the deadline, and the two biggest ones have both, of course, involved Mikko Rantanen. The first time being dealt from the Colorado Avalanche to the Carolina Hurricanes in exchange for Martin Necas, Jack Drury, second-round pick. I believe there's another selection in there as well. And now being flipped to the Dallas Stars with an extension, 8 years at $12 million a season, which in a rising cap world for a player like Mikko Rantanen, who is going to have a blast playing in the Dallas Stars system, especially compared to the Carolina Hurricanes, who, I mean, the Hurricanes play a really cycle-based, heavy kind of game. And even though Rantanen's a big power forward kind of player, he's become as dominant as he is by playing dynamic rush offense in Colorado alongside of Nathan MacKinnon. And he's going to have the chance to play exactly that brand of hockey in Dallas with players like Roope Hintz and Miro Heiskanen, of course, as well, his two Finnish compatriots that are already stars in Dallas, and he's only going to join them. So the Finnish allegiance grows in Dallas, and the Stars acquire their franchise power forward for the next 8 years here of his contract. And in return, the Carolina Hurricanes received Logan Stankoven, 2 first-round selections, both in 2026 and 2028. Both are top 10 protected, though with the Dallas Stars, I I'd be surprised if they needed the protection, at least for the 2026 one. 2028 is sure a couple years out, but still, this lineup is built to win for a very long time now. I don't really see any noticeable weaknesses in the Dallas Stars depth chart, and their prospect pool is not half bad beyond that. But those 2 first-round picks, again, 2028 and 2026, and there are also 2 third-round selections in 2026 and 2027. So a lot of different pieces going Carolina's way, and if we know anything about the Carolina Hurricanes, it's to not underestimate the value of those 2 third-round draft picks thrown in, because the Canes continuously make great draft selections through the middle and late rounds on high value, high skill swings, not all of whom hit, but the ones who do become really useful pieces pretty quickly. We've seen that with Jackson Blake already this season. Nikita Artemonov, who was just drafted last year after falling further than he probably should have because he's an undersized, high motor Russian winger, has been scoring a bunch in the KHL. These depth selections can still contribute to something for Carolina, but even though there are those 2 first-round draft selections, the fact that there is that top 10 protection is just a little bit of salt in the wound, even if it's not going to come to literally anything. Just hurts that little bit more, because if you were to straight up deal Martin Necas after the torrid start to the season that he had this year for Logan Stankoven and 2 firsts, you probably want to get a little bit more. And I'm saying this as one of the absolute biggest Logan Stankoven fans, and I think that he's going to be tremendous in Carolina. Like, this is your Seth Jarvis 2.0. You just have a second type of Seth Jarvis player in your lineup to have one on each of your top 6 lines. That's going to be a real luxury for a long time, but I don't think that he's going to be moving the needle anywhere near as much as a Mikko Rantanen in a good environment, and I don't think that would have ever been in Carolina. So that trade initially, probably not the best move of the Tulsky era so far. However, salvaging a lot of value out of this, and those 2 first-round selections are also, in my opinion, probably going to lead to a bunch of value for the Carolina Hurricanes. So Canes fans, you're getting a lot back here. Your front office knows how to use draft picks and to invest them into pretty quickly NHL talent, and we could also see them flip these picks at the NHL draft in the offseason to build for next year. I know that there's some disappointment that wasn't done right now at the deadline to at least improve the team a little bit, because for this year, going from Martin Necas and Jack Drury to Mikko Rantanen, now to Logan Stankoven, Stankoven is not the best player of that bunch right now. That is no argument there whatsoever. But I think he's going to be a valuable piece down the road for the Canes. So massive blockbuster deal here. The Dallas Stars are building a core for a long time. They're getting set. They extended Wyatt Johnston as well for, I believe, another 5 years at $8.4 million a season. They are locking down this core and they're making a couple runs at it, and it's going to be fun to see. But so I think the Dallas Stars get an A in this trade. This makes a lot of sense for where they're at, and Logan Stankoven, good as he is, was expendable in this lineup. And for the Carolina Hurricanes, I think they did pretty okay given the situation they found themselves in here on deadline day. So I'll give them a B grade because Stankoven's a great asset. 4 draft selections, 2 in the first round. That's some good swings to take on draft day, and they have one of the better scouting departments in the league to take advantage of that. But moving on, we have a trade between the Colorado Avalanche and the New York Islanders, which sent Brock Nelson, the veteran goal-scoring second-line center, to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Calum Ritchie, a first-round selection in either 2026 or 2027, as well as Oliver Shillington and a conditional 2028 third-round selection in exchange for Nelson and William Dufour. Shillington was immediately just flipped to the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for future considerations, so he was just swiftly moved on, but Calum Ritchie immediately becomes the Islanders' #1 prospect in my eyes. He's such an intelligent two-way center who plays the game the right way, has a really high motor, really, really high IQ, creative playmaker with a deft playmaking touch, and the vision in the offensive zone and finding complex plays is something I've admired in his game going back to his D-1 season. And he's also progressed a lot year to year, and could have been playing NHL minutes this year, probably will be playing NHL minutes next season for the New York Islanders. And I think that he's a great fit in that organization with how they like to play the game of hockey, and will be able to learn a bunch from guys like Bo Horvat in that lineup moving forward. And adding another first-round selection was a necessity here for the Islanders because they haven't had many of these in recent seasons. They're only now starting to build back their prospect core, but adding Calum, Ritchie, and a first-round selection in one of two pretty strong draft classes in 2026 and 2027. It's going to be a late one, sure, but you're still getting a first-round pick. I think this is really good business for the New York Islanders. I'll give them an A+ on this deal. I love Calum Ritchie. I think he has real top six upside and definitely more projectable as a prospect than a guy like Cole Yzerman, which is why I think he has the edge as the top prospect in the organization now. And for the Colorado Avalanche, it's a seller's market, a massive time seller's market. So the prices are steep, but I'll still give them a B+ because they had to do something to stay in the race, and they continued to do something to stay in the race later on. And we'll cover that in the next segment when we talk a bit more in focus on the Boston Bruins. But that wraps up this first segment. In the next one, as I mentioned, we're looking at the Boston Bruins, the Philadelphia Flyers, Toronto Maple Leafs, and Seattle Kraken, as a lot of different trades were made and sellers sold and buyers bought, paying big prices and getting big rewards depending on what position a team found themselves in. But first, a quick message from our sponsors. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for an even bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every single moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, let's keep this episode rolling in the second segment, starting it off with a big trade between the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Philadelphia Flyers, as Scott Laughton made his move to the Maple Leafs, as has been rumored for days and weeks at this point. We've been hearing this in the rumor mill for quite some time, and it has finally materialized, and the Flyers are getting a good return for this player. Laughton is a reliable, high-intensity, checking third-line center, and brings an element to the game that the Leafs have lacked in past playoff seasons. So he's going to be playing an important role on the team this year on that run. But going to the Philadelphia Flyers, there's Nikita Grebenkin and a first-round draft pick. First-round pick for Scott Laughton off the bat. Excellent. Doesn't matter if it's coming from a contender. Getting a first-round selection for Scotty Laughton, I think, is really good value on its own. And in a seller's market, adding in a player like Nikita Grebenkin, who, for Flyers fans who are not in the know, Grebenkin is a really, really, really fun player. And he is a real power forward. I went to a prospects game earlier in the fall between the Montreal Canadiens prospects and the Toronto Maple Leafs. I sat in the second row, so literally right by the Habs bench, right by the glass. And Nikita Grebenkin was playing at left wing that game, and getting the up close and personal view of the speed and power that this player possesses was really quite a humbling experience from the stands. He's 6'2", 209 pounds, really gritty, physically inclined kind of player. He's been playing in the AHL mostly this season with the Toronto Marlies, logging 9 goals and 21 points in 39 games. But The way he plays off puck, I think, is quite mature. He's only 21 years of age. He's turning 22 in early May. But I think that he could be playing some NHL minutes already this season for the Philadelphia Flyers. And he plays the game the Flyers want their players to play. He plays with intent. He plays direct, downhill, physical, middle-driven hockey. He can carry the puck, has some really deft puck skills, pretty hard release. But I think it's mainly been the soft touch playmaking in tight that impressed me the most in flashes in the past year in my viewing. So here's a player that I would be excited for if I were a Philadelphia Flyers fan. So definitely an intriguing little piece coming your way in this trade. But let's move on to the Boston Bruins as they're selling hard. The Atlantic has been incredibly tough this season, and the Boston Bruins are the one team to just be waving the white flag. The Buffalo Sabres have already basically been out of that contention for a while now, but the Bruins will be joining them now that they've dealt 3 key pieces after the Trent Frederic deal to the Edmonton Oilers the other day. Just today, they've dealt Charlie Coyle to the Colorado Avalanche, Brad Marchand to the Florida Panthers, and Brandon Carlo to the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs get Carlo, a really stable right shot defenseman who will play on the second pairing for them, and in exchange are giving up a first-round selection, which seems to be the standard this year at the deadline, and Carlo has some term left and is younger than most of the other players being dealt this time of year, and are also, with the Bruins, getting Fraser Minton from the Toronto Maple Leafs, one of the top prospects in the organization, not for his pure upside and dynamic skill, but because he's a hard-working, checking player who can play down the middle, he can play on the wing, he can play various roles on your penalty kill, or on filling in on your second power play. He can do a bunch of stuff decently well, but the lack of standout trait, I think, is going to keep him from becoming a top 6 forward in the NHL, but still a projected bottom 6 piece and a young player on a cheap contract that is going to be fitting in with what the Boston Bruins are going towards now, which is an actual rebuild. Whereas the Brad Marchand trade apparently was a conditional first-round draft selection that could be a second-round selection. I don't have the information as of yet on what the conditions of that trade are and what has to be fulfilled in order for a first-round pick to be going Boston's direction from the Florida Panthers. But I think that if it ends up being a first-round pick, that's just about palatable from a Boston Bruins perspective in terms of giving up Brad Marchand. I think that especially coming in a seller's market and in a day where you saw Anthony Beauvillier go for a second-round selection to possibly also end up with a second-round selection in return for Brad Marchand, your team captain, team legend, who's also been scoring like 40-something points this season and has been resurging a little bit after a slower start offensively to the campaign. I think Boston Bruins fans are very much hoping that ends up being a guaranteed first or an easily clinched first round draft pick. And then we also had the Charlie Coyle trade, which sent, of course, Charlie Coyle to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Casey Middlestat, who was just acquired at last year's deadline in exchange for Bowen Byram from the Buffalo Sabres. And adding in are William Zellers, a high-scoring, almost goal-a-game player in the USHL this season. Really high IQ, off-puck mover with some pretty good puck skills, but the pace and physicality still have a long way to go to become an NHL piece, as well as a 2025 second-round draft selection are going to the Boston Bruins for Charlie Coyle and a 2026 fifth-round draft pick. So big-time sale in Boston. And let me know in the comments down below if you are a Bruins fan. What are your thoughts on this deadline, on the returns you got on so many of these core players that have been around for so many seasons and very much a turning of the page? I saw a tweet out there today as well saying that I believe there are only 5 players remaining from the roster that set the all-time regular season points record in the NHL, and that was 23 months ago. There's been so much turnover in Boston, but I think that overall there's a decent amount of value going back their way here, but could have definitely hoped for a little bit more with Brad Marchand. But that wraps up this second segment. In the final one, we'll be wrapping up the show talking about the Seattle Kraken, the Pittsburgh Penguins, Anaheim Ducks, and San Jose Sharks, all in the quick fire round to wrap up this trade deadline special. But first, a quick message from our sponsors. All right, let's wrap up this episode here in the final segment, kicking it off with the Seattle Kraken, who made a great trade, in my opinion, with the Tampa Bay Lightning, gaining 2 second-round draft selections in return for Oliver Bjorkstrand, as well as Yanni Gourde, who makes his return to the Tampa Bay Lightning. And this was a really big trade that kicked things off. They also got Mikey Eyssimont back in this trade, a really fun, hyper-intense checking winger who can play in the bottom six and just bring ceaseless energy, but also a lot of speed and some goal-scoring upside, I think, in limited minutes. A fun little player going back the other way to the Seattle Kraken there, but it's that draft capital. Also, didn't even mention it, also a 2025 second-round draft pick accompanying a 2026 first and a 2027 first going to the Seattle Kraken from the Tampa Bay Lightning. And those are coming in seasons where Tampa Bay might not be a playoff team, especially in 2027. At that point, the Kraken might end up getting a lottery selection out of this trade, which would be fantastic value. I think that Oliver Bjorkstrand's a great fit in Tampa Bay. He's going to bring a level of playmaking and overall off-puck intelligence to match the elite thinkers that Tampa Bay have at the top end of their lineup. So he's going to be a good fit. And Yanni Gourde, I mean, I don't think we have to really delve into why he's going to be a great fit as a fourth or third line center in Tampa Bay. He can play minutes when you need him to, but he's going to be a consistently reliable presence there in the bottom half of the lineup come playoff time for the Lightning. But I think the Seattle Kraken out of this get an A+ in my valuation. I really like this deal from their perspective, getting a lot of value back in terms of draft capital, as well as a decent bottom six piece in return for two players that one of whom was on an expiring contract, and Oliver Bjorkstrand was probably not going to be sticking around beyond next season either. So a good deal here for the Seattle Kraken. But speaking of sellers getting decent value, the Pittsburgh Penguins have been in all selling mode. Well, almost. They didn't deal Rickard Rakell. He stuck around with the Pittsburgh Penguins and still has a couple years on his contract beyond this one. So he will be able to be moved in the offseason or next season if he's moved at all. But still, Kyle Dubas and the Penguins found a way to not only add draft capital, but also add some more dynamism in their forward core with their trade with the Nashville Predators, sending a 5th-round draft selection and Michael Bunting to the Predators in exchange for Tommy Novak, a really good transition attacker, decent playmaker, good like per 60 production wherever he's played. He can contribute on a power play as well. I think he'll fit in quite nicely. And also Luke Schenn, who was then flipped to the Winnipeg Jets for a 2026 second round pick and a 2027 third. So a decent amount of draft capital there. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, there was also the trade of Anthony Beauvillier to the Washington Capitals for a 2025 second-round draft selection. So this is what the Penguins have had to be doing. Add draft capital, add young pieces. This team needs desperately to have an influx of youth in the depth chart, in the prospect pool. It's been barren these past seasons, but they're starting to replenish it. And I do believe the future is going to look ever brighter for the Pittsburgh Penguins as we keep progressing through this rebuild. But moving on, another quick little trade. The Anaheim Ducks acquired Herman Traff and a second-round draft pick for Brian Dumoulin in a deal with the New Jersey Devils. Herman Traff was just drafted this past year. He's a 6'2", 6'3" power forward type, really responsible defensively. He's been playing in Hockey Allsvenskan this season. Limited production. He's not the most dynamic guy with the puck on his stick, but I think he's going to be a great fit in that Anaheim Ducks system with the way that he plays off puck, the energy he brings, the physicality he can grow into. I think that this is a potential bottom six piece for the Ducks moving forward, and adding a second round pick, always a useful thing to do. But to wrap up the show, let's talk about the San Jose Sharks, because they made a couple deals here in the final 24 hours before the deadline struck. Starting off with Jake Walman, who was dealt to the Edmonton Oilers in exchange for a 2026 or 2027 first round draft selection. And for this deal, I think the Edmonton Oilers get a B+, because adding a player who can comfortably play on the right side of defense as well as on the left side, I think is something that they've been needing. He's a very comfortable activator. He's one of the most opportunistic activators from the blue line in the NHL, and I think is going to thrive in an environment playing with guys like Connor McDavid, where the ice is just wide open at times, and he can just spring open and has a decent amount of speed, and he just charges towards the net. And his finishing ability has actually been really good in the past couple of seasons. So that's something to look forward to as well from an Edmonton Oilers perspective, but he's just going to bring some decent depth and value that they needed on the blue line. So B+ is my grade. And for the San Jose Sharks, an A grade, I think, is what I give them. Only reason it's not an A+ is because Walman's been playing some really massive minutes for that team, and I think that many of the young players on the roster are going to struggle a bit more here in the final weeks of the season as a result of Walman being moved. But on the flip side, having acquired him as a cap dump alongside of a second round draft selection to get a first at the deadline, 8 months later, ridiculously good business here for the San Jose Sharks and Mike Grier, who just continues to create value out of nothing just year after year after year. And his dealing with contracts has been among the better ones throughout the NHL since his tenure began. But that wraps up today's episode. Please, if you're listening on YouTube, do let me know in the comments down below what trade shocked you the most. Who do you think is the best fit? Which team improved their Stanley Cup chances the very most in the past week? And which prospect do you think was the most underrated ad for a team here around the deadline? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please do make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, you're going to head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel break down everything you need to know to build yourself a really competitive and sustainable lineup. But that wraps things up here for us today. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Sebastian High, and I hope that you tune back in very, very soon.